the experiment ended after 6 months. The day after it ended, the traffic congestion came back, and people started grumbling about the fact that they no longer had their system. The referendum took place, and it passed. The majority of Stockholm residents decided they would rather pay for the service that they get and get a good service rather than have a free service that led to frustration. London was the first city to try a tolling system. It became the issue on which a mayoralty candidate campaigned. He said, "Elect me mayor, and I will bring in this tolling system." To everyone's surprise, he was elected. The tolling system was brought in, and it was popular. He then ran for re-election on that scheme. It ended up becoming unpopular in London because it became used for all kinds of politically correct measures, including global warming. So all kinds of taxes were heaped on. But when the tolling was used in a way that was simply meant as an economic instrument to charge more at peak periods, to charge less at off-peak periods.
I listened to you very carefully, and I could see how that could work, but doesn't that then translate as penalizing the people that have 9-to-5 jobs because they're getting to work early in the morning? I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've been on a mission for 25 years, so I don't have to deal with what 95% or 99% of the people have to deal with every day, having to be on the road and at a place at 8 or 9. And therefore, the peak hours of traffic congestion are for the average person who has to be at a work location by 8 or 9, right? And then has an hour for lunch between 12 and 1 or 1 and 2, and then is going to go home sometime between 5 and 7. Most employers are not going to shift their minds about that. So how do you see that supporting the average person?
When people decide where they're going to work and where they're going to live, they usually take their transportation costs into account.
Right.
Often people decide, I can get a bigger house further out. It means I have to travel an extra half hour or an extra hour, but it's worth it to me. So people make that kind of calculation. They're always trading off distance, size of house, with convenience and cost. And usually when they figure out the cost of living further out, they will look at, say, their gasoline costs and maybe the wear and tear on their car, but they'll trade that off against saving a lot of money, perhaps on the capital purchase of their house. Well, if there was a more realistic calculation that occurred, if they had to account not only for the cost of using their car and their gasoline, but the cost of the road, which right now people don't see directly. Often they don't pay at all for the roads that they use. If they had to pay for the cost of their roads, they would start making a different calculation. And what we would see is people would start living closer to their work or closer to their school, and their travel times would come down, and therefore their commuting costs would go down. So we would see people's living patterns change naturally as they responded to the pricing signals.
Maybe I'm not sure. I can see it on a conceptual level, but in the practicality, there's so many people I know that live an hour or an hour and a half that drive in to, let's say, Burbank or Los Angeles to do their day job. And they'll do that, but if they had to live close to where they were working, they would pay double the rent they're paying now. And I think when you get down to the brass tacks of that translation, I'm not sure it would equate exactly the way that you're saying, but I think it's an interesting prospect to consider tolls. I just don't know how the people that have traditional day jobs wouldn't be penalized in the process.
In the past, cities were residential areas. We still have in our cities very nice residential areas, but most of them have been degraded over time. They were really degraded since the 1930s. The Depression prevented reinvestment in nice areas, and then the wartime economy made it difficult, and then public attitudes changed largely because road systems were subsidized and the interstates came in, and public dollars transformed the traditional lifestyle that Americans had. I think by withdrawing the subsidized road systems that were brought in place mostly after World War II, we would revert to the kinds of living patterns that historically we had, which were living much closer to home, shorter travel distances. I think there would be more urban communities, fewer suburban communities. Communities would tend to be denser, more compact, more services within communities. So I think living patterns would change, but they would change not to something terribly unfamiliar. They would change to what they were like, say, in the 1920s.
Would you be interested in building a new eco-city or developing some ecosystem and an eco-city somewhere around the world?
No, I'm not. I'm not a utopian that way.
What do you do at Urban Renaissance?
It's a division of the same foundation, of Energy Probe Research Foundation, and it's concerned with precisely the kind of issue I just described, with road tolling, with the living patterns that people have. What we have done over the last few decades is heavily subsidized rural development and suburban development, and at the expense of urban development. And the effect of it has been to decrease densities in cities, so they are less city-like, and to increase densities on the outskirts, so that they're less rural. And the effect of that is to create a kind of a mush, where we've lost our wilderness areas, we've lost our rural areas, and we've also lost our urban areas. So I'd like to see a restoration of the balance, and I don't want to impose that balance. My utopia is simply letting people do what they naturally would do if they weren't being pushed and prodded this way or that by government incentives of one kind or another.
Do you have any concern about the radiation from microwave radiation stations, or the level of radiation that's coming in from outer space, and how that may affect climate?
Well, that has always affected climate. A lot of the solar scientists have theories about how radiation affects climate, but this isn't something we're about to change. You know, the sun is going to keep shining for a few billion more years, and I don't see any way of dealing with that.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us as we end this discussion?
One point that people often don't appreciate is that our attempts to comply with Kyoto not only have economic costs, they have environmental costs. In fact, Kyoto has become the single biggest destroyer of the global environment. My environmental group works with citizens groups in the third world, works with them at the grassroots level, and many of them are up in arms over what Kyoto has done to them. When we try to cut back on carbon emissions here, often through mechanisms such as carbon credits, we might purchase a carbon offset. Well, the other half of that transaction is the purchase of a carbon sink, typically somewhere in the third world. Typically, it's something like a eucalyptus plantation. Eucalyptus is a fast-growing tree. It's very good at taking carbon out of the air. Well, to get the land to plant that eucalyptus plantation, farmers are often driven off their land in the third world, and then the carbon credits are used to finance a eucalyptus plantation, or an old-growth forest might be taken down and replaced with a eucalyptus plantation. Carbon credits are also financing hydro dams throughout the third world. Many, many hundreds of hydro dams. And hydro